So I just think that there's, again, lots of lessons that we could all be taking in from Indigenous peoples of every land space across the globe, if we just take the time to really see how things are going and to see that, this kind of colonial and capitalistic structure that we've been living in is not the perfect way, and we could be looking at our food system completely different.
Hey folks, welcome to episode 5 of season 2 of the You Can't Eat Money podcast with Chef Sean Sherman, aka the Sioux Chef. Chef Sean is the co-founder and co-owner of Owamni, the James Beard Foundation's Best New Restaurant of 2022, alongside his co-founder and co-owner Dana Thompson, with whom he also created NATIFS, which stands for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, and is home to the Indigenous Food Lab. Sean is also involved with the BIPOC Foodways Alliance, which is working to dismantle white supremacy through food. In this episode, we take a very necessary look back at how the United States was built through systemic violence that sought to disconnect Indigenous people from their land and culture, of which disconnecting them from their traditional foodways played a huge role. Alongside examining this history, we also take a look at Sean's journey from working in kitchens and as a US Forest Service Surveyor in the northern Black Hills as a teenager, to the work he's undertaking at Owamni and NATIFS to help shine a light on Indigenous foodways around the world. Chef Sean also explains what a decolonized Indigenous North American cuisine looks like and why that doesn't include ranch dressing and sodas. What Chef Sean Sherman is doing is incredible and extremely necessary. I'm very grateful he took the time away from this important work to chat. Hopefully you'll learn as much from listening to this episode as I did researching and recording it. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. Now on to the latest episode of the You Can't Eat Money podcast with Chef Sean Sherman. Today we have with us on the You Can't Eat Money podcast, Chef Sean Sherman. Thanks so much, Sean, for taking time to chat with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I read that you got a pretty early start in the kitchen, but also I think when you were around 16, you worked with US Forest Service as a surveyor identifying plants and the local flora in your area. How has that sort of relationship with the natural world influenced your approach as a chef?
Growing up, even just being on the reservation and just having a lot of freedom running around the plains and the Badlands, which is part of where the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota is, we just were outside all the time, because that's just the lifestyle. We didn't really have TV. We had like 1.5 channels, and that was never the option. So we were always outside, and we were just always in the grass and just playing with everything. And then, when I did move to the Black Hills and off the reservation before high school and started working restaurants at a very young age. And then at the end of the high school career, when I was a senior in high school, that's when I worked for the Forest Service. And I was a field surveyor, so it was kind of the low end job there, but it taught me a lot just because that job, I had to learn all the names of the plants in the northern Black Hills. And I just started seeing a lot more, and growing up on the reservation, we did harvest some wild food. So I just knew that there was, this connection to plants out there. We harvested the prairie turnip called timsala. We harvested choke cherries. And there was just a bunch of stuff out there. For me, when I had the epiphany of trying to understand what my Native American heritage was, when it meant to from a culinary perspective, and there wasn't a lot of information out there, that was one of the things I turned to, was plants, to start to understand, to try to recover the knowledge that my ancestors had of the world around us.
And so understanding that plant knowledge seems like it was quite different from what you've talked about, what you grew up mainly eating on the reservation with the commodity food program. Through all the research that you did, you kind of had to discover your own food ways because that wasn't readily available for a number of reasons that we'll get into in a couple of minutes. But that must have been quite a challenge in terms of understanding how those foodways fit together in terms of the commodity food program, but also some of the wild and foraged foods that you're eating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because just looking backwards, I just looked at what was available to me on the reservation and trying to understand why I didn't know that much about Lakota foods, even though I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm enrolled. Both my parents are enrolled. Everybody grew up there. So why did we have very few recipes of what would have been originally Lakota? And it just took me on that path to just understand what happened to us as an Indigenous community, the battles that we had with the United States government and the time frame that all this happened in, because we were still battling the United States till the 1890s, and there's just so much you see, and it's really like the loss of our education. So the assimilation efforts that happened shortly after the reservations are formed and the schools that we're forced to go to, and it replaces our countless generations of knowledge with a westernized education viewpoint, but it erases so much valuable knowledge of just the world around us, the plants, the traditions, the prayers, the connection and the relationship. And we lose out on so much more plant diversity that used to be in our diet. And it's replaced with government subsidized foods, which is the commodity food program and the FDPIR program. And growing up on Pine Ridge, we had one grocery store which basically services an area the size of Connecticut, and there's just very little food availability there. So for me, this work was more important than just trying to understand what my heritage foods were, but to also work towards making changes that need to happen still today.
And to that point, you talked about I think it was in your TED talk, you talked a lot about what happened in the 1800s as being this key point where the US government kind of really went out and tried to remove and in many ways eliminate, sort of the Native American people that they encountered. George Washington talked about ruining their crops, and there was this decimation of the buffalo herds from 60 million in 1800 to only a few hundred left by 1900. I think part of that assimilation piece that you just mentioned is that also sort of in a way disconnecting the indigenous populations from the land and the sort of traditional foodways that they were attached to.
Yeah, it's important just to understand the colonial history of what is the United States, and it's understanding how, from an indigenous perspective, what was going on. But you have to look at that one century, the 1800 and 1900, to really kind of put it in perspective, because the United States government is very young at the turn of that century. There's been, so much aggressiveness. It all starts with George Washington sending General Sullivan out on a march to remove a bunch of all the native people in that whole region, and General Sullivan writes back at the end of that march in 1779, I believe it is, and says that I've fulfilled my duty and there's not a single side of an Indian on this side of Niagara. And you can read documentation about people who were along that journey with General Sullivan, and the massive civilizations that they were wiping out, because these huge townships with just miles and miles of farm fields all around them that had been there for, long before the Europeans had been there, and just pushing them all out, burning everything down. And who knows how many like heirloom seeds and things are lost during that push. And the United States also comes up with the Northwest Ordinance, which really sets the framework for justifying what to do with indigenous lands that are acquired, usually through violence or coercion. If you fly over from the east to the west, that's why you see that grid work, of that square by square by square, and it all kind of sets that framework early on. And the United States gets a thirst because it realizes that the more land spaces it acquires, then it could commodify it and make a ton of money off of it. And it becomes very dangerous to be indigenous peoples, especially as the design like ways for how does a region become a territory? How does a territory become a state? And what does that mean? And one of those clauses was that the white population had to outweigh the indigenous population, which made it even more dangerous to be indigenous peoples. And we just see so much intense violence across the 1800s. California wipes out over 95% of its indigenous population within a decade through justified means, and also just state-sponsored genocide, because they're literally paying out bounties for, you can get paid by the body part. So people were just coming into town with body parts all over their mules and horses and just cashing in. And some of those bounties would be up to $200. And if you do the inflation of what's $200 in 1863, 1865, that's a lot of money, and California pays out that money, which gets paid back by the United States government. And those are just examples that are just there of this genocide that's there. It's just in the history books. So I think it's really important for us to be understanding the history of things. And it's such a weird time, because now some school systems in some states are completely going backwards and re-whitewashing histories because they feel like the histories are too uncomfortable for their students. But the United States is born in violence, and we should always be aware of that.
And if we dig a little bit deeper, I think you showed a language map and sort of an ecosystem sort of map in your TED Talk as well, just about the diversity. So when we refer to and think about sort of Native American population as a whole, there's actually hundreds. I think there's somewhere around 567 or so registered tribes in the United States still. This isn't sort of a homogeneous population. There's a lot of diversity there, and there's a lot of different foodways there. So obviously, it's not just wiping out one of ways of eating, ways of believing, ways of living, but it's actually wiping out a huge swath of them, which I think, we look at our industrialized food system now, it all kind of looks the same. To your point that you've made in a lot of your talks is like, you kind of looked around 10 or 15 years ago and you said there's a lot of great restaurants in the United States, but none of them actually reflect the land that they're on.
Yeah, it's really true, because I opened up my restaurant in July of 21, Owamni, and in Minneapolis. And, we're extremely unique because of just what our philosophy is and what we do. And we're really one of the only restaurants out there like that. There's very few native restaurants out there in the US as it stands. And, for us to really push for decolonization, push against European ingredients, so you don't find wheat flour and dairy products and cane sugar on the menu. And you do find a lot of plant diversity, a lot of wild foods, a lot of native heirloom agricultural products, a lot of game meat. And, we should have restaurants that become extremely regional, so our vision is to help support that, which is why I developed this nonprofit called NATIFS, or North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, and the nonprofit kitchen that we have in Minneapolis called Indigenous Food Lab, to be basically a support center to help develop more. So we can help develop more entrepreneurs, we can help tribes develop more food operations, we can help with recipe and menu development. And we just really, have this vision of one day being able to drive across the United States or North America in any direction and visiting Native, Indigenous focused restaurants that really focus on region, and we can start to see that amazing diversity that's out there.
Given the way that food seems to be trending with places like Noma that are particularly of an area, of a region, of a place and time, it seems like that's where food should be headed anyways, both from a recognizing the indigenous people and foodways of the area, but also for the sustainability and health of the food system.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, Noma is a great example of, because Chef Rene, he comes from a lot of fine dining. He was at El Bulli, and then he moves that vision back to Copenhagen, and opens up Noma. But in the beginning, he was doing high-end, modernist Mediterranean foods. And it was good, but as far as I understand, because I didn't go to it back then, but I know that something was missing and it wasn't what he wanted. And he realized why is he doing Mediterranean food way up in Denmark? So he starts to really look at what is Denmark and what is the food of that region, and starts to implement, like using all these flavors around him that are just out there, and looking at more plant diversity and connecting with the land space, And I think people misinterpret that because they see him as introducing a new cuisine called the new Nordic cuisine, basically. And people start to mimic that all over the world. But the point was not to, make what is Nordic cuisine, but just to connect with his own heritage when it comes down to it. So there's a lot of similarities in that situation. And, for anybody in the Americas that come from indigenous communities, there's just a lot of work to recover, because we lost so much because of that push in the 1800s. And the 1900s weren't much kinder to us as indigenous peoples, as we just go through a lot of continued racism and segregation. And, we can't celebrate our own religions until 1978. We're not citizens until 1924. We can't vote like most people of color until the latter part of that century. And there's just a lot of things that are still built against us. So we just really see, indigenous peoples on a pan-indigenous scale, and look at it on a global scale, because we see indigenous peoples everywhere that were affected by colonialism. It's not just the U.S. or Canada, but it's everywhere. It's all the Americas, North and South, Central. It's Africa, it's India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. And there's just so much damage that's happened to indigenous peoples on a global scale. But we see so much commonalities with the way people are living also on that global scale, with that connection to the world around them, the connection and understanding of plants, and just those many, many generations of that knowledge to give us those tools to live sustainably with that world around us.
Your restaurant won Best New Restaurant at the James Beard Awards. or earlier this year, right? It was 2022. So what kind of conversations are you having both with diners who actually come and eat at the restaurant, and also with sort of up and coming chefs who may be of sort of an indigenous or native background and want to participate in what you're doing with decolonizing the menu and decolonizing sort of the great American restaurant?
Yeah, I mean, we're just really trying to set the tone for what's possible with modern indigenous foods, and just working really hard on the intentionality of what we do and the philosophy that we've really stuck to, just to showcase what sets us apart. And we're just, again, trying to be that support center. So we just want to have open doors for other indigenous entrepreneurs to come and learn with us, to see what we're doing so they can develop their own philosophy and their own styles, and just creating kitchens that can support that, basically. And we just see a very bright future. There's a lot of opportunity out there, and it's giving us a lot more opportunity to have larger conversations. We were just in DC talking with a bunch of people at the USDA about possible changes of, where could the FDPIR program really go. And really, getting those doors open to have those kinds of conversations to make some real changes. And we're just going to continue to build and build, because we see a path. It's going to take a lot of hard work, but we want to just secure indigenous education and indigenous food access out there for communities everywhere. There's just tons of federally recognized tribes in the U.S. today, and Canada, and 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous. So there's so much indigeneity, and there's just so much history and systems built against us still today that has to change.
There was this really great video I found with you and Dallas Goldtooth, who's made a name for himself in Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls on television. And you talk about the importance of community-based food systems. Can you explain what a community-based food system looks like?
Sure. I mean, if you look at any indigenous community and how they're surviving, pre-colonization, it took an entire community to work on the food system that they had, because food didn't carry a monetary value. It just was an immense effort by the entire community to grow food, to curate the forests or the plains or wherever they might be, the wild spaces around them, to help grow more foods, and to know where those are, and just to have that deep connection to all these things growing, and to continue on all of this tradition when it comes to the agricultural scene, which is a large swath of North America where agriculture was happening, and just all the traditions that go along with everything. And when animals come in from hunting, it would be a team effort to break everything down and preserve everything right away. And one of those snippets we learn in history is that Native American people, it's a very general statement, but they'll say Native American people would use every part of the bison. But that's just an example that we had to be extremely resourceful, because we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful. And we were able to, because of countless generations of knowledge handed down, knowing what to do with all of these pieces, But we had that same mentality for anything, whichever animal we're harvesting, or fish, or plants, or whatever. We just used all these byproducts of what we were making, because again, we just had to be resourceful, and we were extremely resourceful. So I just think that there's, again, lots of lessons that we could all be taking in from indigenous peoples of every land space across the globe, if we just take the time to really see how things are going, and to see that, this kind of colonial and capitalistic structure that we've been living in is not the perfect way, and we could be looking at our food system completely different.
How do we move in a direction that allows us, I think, using some of the lessons you just talked about from indigenous populations, but how do we create a food system that is actually sustainable?
Well, we just need some changes, and we have technology to make changes. We just have to actually do the work. So I showcase places like Palm Springs that has 120 golf courses, which is an insane situation because it's in the middle of the desert. So if you look at a flyover of Palm Springs, it's like this little green oasis, but it's man. And if we put that kind of effort into growing green spaces for food and food production, that one little township could probably feed most of the food needs in California alone. And so there's just so much that we should be really rethinking when it comes to how we're utilizing our resources. And the upcoming water crisis is real. That's happening in real time. We're seeing it. And, it's going to be detrimental to a lot of people in the Southwest and California and those areas that that is getting hit really, really hard. And we're just going to have to change the way we think about farming practices and who we're allowing to utilize this massive amount of water and for what, because we're allowing large companies to just suck up a whole bunch of water for the sole purpose of making plastic bottles, for example. Or, no shade on the wine industry, but you look at like these beautiful valleys in California, like Napa, where that should be so fruitful, where we could be literally growing all sorts of food. And instead of it's a monocrop, and they're using so much water for that particular thing. And, as much as we all love wine, it's something that we can't literally survive off of. We could try to, but it's not going to do us good. So we just really need to be thinking about better ways to feed ourselves and our nation and our world when it comes down to it, because we're all humans and food is such a basic need for all of us, and to have all of our food controlled by capitalistic and just all these kinds of organizations, it's not good for any of us. And I think that we should have learned from the pandemic, like people who are relying on all of these foods being shipped all over the nation and the world, and these shortages and distribution things that happen because of that kind of situation. Like if we were just focused on purchasing local and buying local and supporting local foods, and then we could really start to be a lot more food secure, so and people have to really learn where food comes from. And, cities need to make initiatives to start like growing foods, to create pantries for their own community instead of relying on outside sources and dollars to do that for them.
It's really interesting because I was reading an article about your restaurant, and in that sort of development space around the restaurant, there is 15 identified plants in that are labeled with the Dakota word as well as the English word. Is that part of this idea of like helping people understand where their food is actually coming from? Because then maybe they go in the restaurant and see one of those items on the menu.
Yeah, I mean, I think people just need to wake up and start to see the world around them and everything that nature has to offer us, and then it'll make more sense why we want to protect nature, why we want to keep like big oil companies out of wild rice fields and things like that, because all of this stuff has so much knowledge. So that we just, created that kind of passive education around the restaurant so people can walk around, see all these plants, because we had them put only indigenous plants back in the ground, and then even take it a step further to learn the native names of that plants, because that's the true name of that plant in that soil. So, so if you walk around Owamni, you'll see all these little gardens everywhere, and you'll see like the Dakota name of a plant first, whether it's wild ginger or whatever. Then it'll have the English name and a descriptor of how it can be utilized. And you can find a lot of these plant pieces in various parts of the menus, just to showcase what's possible out there. Because again, like there's so much food around us, there's so much medicine around us, and we need to just really reconnect, because the Western diet's almost largely ignored the immense plant diversity here in North America and what's possible of plants that really like to grow here and help rebuild the soil, and is just a part of this environment.
When it comes to the farming practices, just connect the dots on the last couple of questions, like to the farming practices that are implemented, what you put on the menu, thinking about sourcing locally, like what is the checklist you go through when you try to, I don't know, create the menu for Owamni and make sure that you can source the things that you need? Like, how do you think about where to get that from and who to get it from, and checking their farming practices or production practices?
Yeah, I mean, our tier of purchasing just goes, we try and purchase from Indigenous local first, and then Indigenous national, and then we support BIPOC local next, and then just our local allies around us. And then we have, we buy organic at the very bottom of that level, and we're able to get a lot of really interesting products. And so then we also think very seasonally. We think about proteins, because we took away beef, pork, and chicken just to showcase the immense protein choices that are out there. So we have a lot of animals like deer and antelope and elk and bison and rabbit. We have lots of birds like turkeys and duck and geese and quail. We have all sorts of freshwater lake fish, because we're here in Minnesota where we have 15,000 freshwater lakes, including Lake Superior. And and then sometimes we'll make recipes that are very specific to other regions. Maybe it's a very regions like Northwest Pacific recipe, or an East Coast, or Southwest, or Mexico, or Alaska. And we just really try to think about, like, when we create these recipes, do these ingredients really make sense together, and can they paint a picture and tell a story about culture and region and season and all those pieces together?
And so how do we take sort of the ideas that you're talking about here, using the indigenous ingredients that are local to your area and sort of spread them? Because I think industrial agriculture has sort of made everybody have the same expectation that if they go to a grocery store in California versus New York versus Texas, they're probably going to find the same, Wonder Bread on every single shelf. How do we actually go about getting, to use a business word, like scaling that idea of indigenous food that is local and comes from the place that you are?
Well, I want to see a lot more just access to indigenous foods from indigenous food producers, which is why we're launching a small native market concept here in Minneapolis, where our local community will have at least one place they can go to and find all these products, both locally and nationally, and knowing that all of these products are coming from indigenous food producers and just curating that, and then also helping that grow outwards, and then we can create distribution points to help move that around. But we just really want to, to see that vision happen, to start to create that food access. Because if you look at most grocery stores, they are all the same, and even all the menus. You drive across the nation, because I travel a lot, I can almost write the menu to the restaurant I'm going into before I even walk in the door, because it's all going to be the same. It's just going to be like a Caesar salad and a hamburger and a pasta and blah, blah, blah. And like, we just need a lot more diversity in our diets, and we need a lot more regional understanding of where we come from and what's really truly there, and just really being proud of these regional foods, these regional flavors, and these regional seasons, and just start to see more and more of that, and start to really push away from the industrialization of everything and the homogenization of everything too. So I just see such a bright future. And I think that, as a chef and as a restaurateur, I feel like it's part of our responsibility to make sure that we are making people happy, but also feeding people healthy foods, because our restaurant is extremely healthy, and we're not touting ourselves as a health food restaurant, but we're gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, and we're like what every single fad diet's trying to attain, and it just happens to be the indigenous diet of this continent. And we just really want to open up people's minds that if you eat healthier, if you eat more local, if you eat less processed foods, like, you're just going to feel better physically and mentally. And we're just trying to set that example of what is possible. So you're not going to find ranch dressing and sodas and things like that at our restaurant, but you're going to find just a lot of really interesting flavors that people haven't tried before. But if you looked around, you would see all these flavors just literally right outside your door.
What advice would you give to someone who's not really a chef, just more of an eater, about how to adopt some of the practices and ideas that you're trying to implement to create a healthier, more diverse food system when they go to the grocery store, they select something on the menu? Like, how should we be eating going forward?
Well, we should just be really thinking about the restaurants we're going to and where they're purchasing their foods. And we should be supporting restaurants that are supporting a lot of local food growth, and really highlighting a lot of regional and seasonal flavors, because so many restaurants are just using straight box trucks. Everything's coming frozen, everything's just coming pre-portioned, and nobody's processing. It's not fresh food, so we should really be thinking about what we're eating, but also what these restaurants are serving. So, I mean, food tastes good. It's great to have like some greasy double cheeseburger with all these things on it. But if you break it down, like, you're not getting any plant diversity. You don't even know where this meat is coming from. Like, very little about where this bread product or what kind of fillers are in it. So, like, we should just be really focused on fresher, healthier, less processed foods in general, So people should search and find some of that. And food is expensive, so some people don't like to go to some of those restaurants because they can have slightly higher price points and stuff. But knowing that at least those dollars are going to be supporting some of the local growing situations, and going to be helping people that have a lot of intention and are doing some really good work. And you can find those kinds of restaurants basically all over the place. They're usually smaller groups or smaller restaurants. Sometimes they're larger restaurants, but we need to make that stuff more attainable, and we just need to see it, and we should be doing everything we can to support it.